yet?
No, we didn't.
Sorry. Good, thanks. I appreciate that. We're in Titus. So second week in Titus, really. So the Apostle Paul is writing to Titus right around the year 62, 63, somewhere in that general ballpark. And this is taking place after the book of Acts ends, and Paul's moving around from place to place, and he's left Titus on the island of Crete. And I'll just spend a second, in a minute or so, I'll spend a minute just kind of showing you where that is, just to remind you a little bit. He's left Titus on Crete as the pastor of a church there. And these guys have worked together for a long time. We're talking 15 plus years. And so Titus he's not like a novice. Titus isn't a noob. If you know what a noob is? Kids, can you tell us what a noob is? No. Well, the Knife Out boys, I think they know what it is, but...
Somebody that sucks at video games,
That
basically.
wasn't the answer I was expecting. Let me hold up. Let me rephrase that. Someone who's new at, say, video games and maybe isn't that great, right? I think that's probably what you meant to say there. And they just want to keep answering. they want to preach, so I don't, so a noob in ministry would kind of be like a guy that doesn't have experience, you know what I mean? A guy who, in video game language, he's not so good. In ministry language, he's not very experienced, right? Titus is not that. Titus is a veteran. So he's experienced and he's biblically qualified. But he's got a tough challenge ahead of him because he needs to pastor in Crete, on the island of Crete. And Crete is full of what? Cretans. So, we talked a little bit about that term and how I call people Cretans. Look at these Cretans, who vandalize and stuff like that. Look at the Cretans. And we had a couple of Cretans on our flight who upon landing fought with each other, and there was blood. And I was like, look at these Cretans, you know what I mean? And it comes from the island of Crete, really. And the Philistines, we talked a little bit about that, just kind of for fun on the side. The Philistines come from the island of Crete, according to the Old Testament. So Crete is full of Cretans. It's full of liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. I didn't say it, God did, okay? And we'll look at that in a couple of weeks. Crete is full of meaningless talk and deception, and so it's a challenge to minister here. But Titus is just the man for the job, and that's why Paul left him on Crete. Look at Titus 1, and we just reviewed this, we just looked at it real quick at the end of 2 weeks ago's message. For this reason, I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. So Paul tells us the reason why he left Titus. He tells Titus the reason why he left him on Crete. And again, just as a reminder, Crete is a Mediterranean island, and this is the Roman world. There is some significance here, and you'll see, it doesn't kind of take rocket science to figure out why. If this is, generally speaking, the Roman Empire, and you kind of zoom right in on the middle, you have the island of Crete. Kind of right smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And so Paul, after Acts, he visits this little island here, and I think I have, yeah. This is the kind of the spread of Christianity along the Roman Empire and a little beyond it. Right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea is Crete, and Paul leaves Crete and he travels right here. All right? We don't really know a whole lot about what he was doing there, but we know that he leaves Crete and he goes over to this town. And we see two reasons why he leaves Titus there in this town. There are two reasons why on this island. Two reasons. I would probably argue it's not two reasons. I would probably argue it's one reason, and Paul states the reason why I left them and how to accomplish the reason, how to accomplish the goal. But we'll just kind of call it two reasons for the sake of the argument. Anyway, for this reason, I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains. All right, and so the first reason, or I would say really the main reason, the main goal is to set things in order, to get things straightened out. Again, things need to be corrected here on Crete. Crete is a difficult place, and so he needs to set in order what remains. He needs to correct what remains, the things that maybe Paul wasn't able to accomplish when he was on the island. So, Paul's not there for decades, you know what I mean? So he can go, he can kind of set some things in order, and then there are other things that need to be set in order that he didn't yet accomplish. And that's what Titus needs to do. The phrase could be translated, what was left unfinished, that you would set in order what was left unfinished. So when Paul gets to the island of Crete, he finds problems, right? And he finds things that need to be taken care of. Again, can't take care of all those things. Titus is the man to finish the job. Now, you might remember from a couple of weeks ago, and you might not, that Crete's 160 miles long. That's more than one church, okay? Especially in the ancient world, especially since in the ancient world, you can really only travel, let's call it 20 miles or so, between 17 and 23 miles in a day. So your church isn't going to be 4 days away. Right now, I understand there are port cities and stuff like that, and it's a little bit quicker to get from one port to the other, but all those shipping lanes close in November. So from November till something like April, you can't even sail from one end of the island to the other. So your church is not going to be 3 to 5 days away. There are churches on the island of Crete. Okay, I don't know how many. We don't know how many. But there are cities on the island. There are a lot of cities. There are presumably a lot of churches, and there are a lot of spiritual problems in those cities. And there's a lot of immorality on the island of Crete. And so Titus has his work cut out for him. And Titus is not going to be able to take care of all those problems by himself. It's not possible. He can't really be in more than one place at a time. And there are too many congregations for Titus to handle. And so the best way to resolve the problem, that's why I say, I really see it as one reason and a way to accomplish that reason. Some would see it as two purposes here. But for this reason, I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains. And this is how you do it. This is how you accomplish it. That's how I read it. All right, and I think I have some support in the original language too, because you do have a singularity here, a singular reason, right? This is the reason, and this is how you accomplish it. This is the thing you need to do, and this is how you do it. That you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. And so really what Titus needs to do is appoint biblically qualified pastors across the island. And isn't that kind of what the Apostle Paul did? I mean, what did Paul do in his missionary journeys? He'd go to a place, he'd minister the gospel, people would get saved, he'd plant a church, and he would get someone to pastor that church. He would train someone up or send someone there or whatever, right? So that's what Titus needs to do. He needs to find men, perhaps even train them and install them. And what does that tell me about the timing of Titus' stay? Or I should say the length of Titus' stay on Crete? Like, this is not like a 1 month thing. You know what I mean? This is going to take time. Now he will be asked to leave, and there's a replacement, but the expectation is to kind of go back and get this work done. This is something that's going to take time. It's going to take investment. The churches of Crete need spiritual leaders. The Cretan churches need quality pastoral leadership, and their future might just depend on it. Now Titus is a representative of the Apostle Paul, and the churches really at this point may not quite have been ready to call their own pastors. And so that's why it's so important for Titus to appoint elders in every city. Now, in case you're confused about this term elders, that's just another word for the spiritual leaders of church. A pastor, elder, bishop. You see that in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. You see it in Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and up through verse 28. You see this is it's used interchangeably with the term overseer, right? A pastor, elder, bishop is the same office. Okay, so appointing elders, that is appointing pastors. Now, calling a pastor, it's not an easy task. Who here has been part of a pulpit committee in the past? Maybe just a couple, maybe. I think at least two, maybe three. Before I was called to be the assistant pastor here, I had seen a couple of, what's the word I'm looking for? Questionnaires, pastoral questionnaires for pulpit questionnaires. What a church is looking for in the pastor. And most of the time, it doesn't quite hit the mark. Okay, I guess some of the things that they're asking are kind of givens, and some of the things they're not asking are really important. So oftentimes, a church doesn't quite know what to look for. The average Christian doesn't quite know what to look for, or they value the wrong types of things. But Titus does know what to look for. Again, he's a seasoned veteran in ministry. He's been in ministry for 15 years with the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul knows what to look for in a pastor. Now, in a perfect world, I'm going to say this. In a perfect world, the pastor is involved at some level. I believe 2 pastors ago, the pastor was involved in helping this church find its next pastor. Am I right about that? So the pastor, 2 pastors before me, was involved in helping the church call the pastor that was before me. All right, does that make sense? And really, in a perfect world, that's a good thing, because the pastor is the lead. He's the leader of the church. He's overseeing the church. He wants to help make sure that the church has the quality guy to take over, right? To be the next pastor, to care for the flock. Again, that's in a perfect world. That doesn't always work out. Like, for instance, sometimes a pastor has to leave a church abruptly. Sometimes a pastor has to leave for various reasons, or if he ends up taking another ministry somewhere and he's not able to stay behind and help them find. I mean, oftentimes that's the case. Or sometimes the pastor of the church has lost his objectivity, right? And so maybe the church is like, I don't know how much influence I want from the previous pastor. Sometimes the previous pastor has an agenda or something like that disagrees with what the church is trying to. Maybe they have different goals or different things like that. So it's not always a perfect thing, okay? But in a perfect world, the pastor should help the church find a new pastor. That doesn't really happen. It doesn't really happen. I've really only heard of a couple of instances anywhere where that's happened. So when I found out it happened here, I was kind of surprised. I was kind of shocked, especially given it doesn't matter. And so again, in a perfect world, the pastor can help set up the next pastor, but it doesn't always work that way in today's world. Nevertheless, the responsibility to appoint pastors in the churches was a grave one, and Paul reminds Titus that this is something he needs to do. And so Titus needs to set things in order by appointing pastors. And this is the type of guy that Titus needs to appoint. Verses 6 through 9. And we're not going to spend many weeks on that. Really, I'm going to deal with one issue this week, and then I'm going to try to get all the rest of them in next week. All right. Last year, we were in 1 Timothy 3, and I feel like we spent something like 4 or 5 weeks unpacking those 7 verses. And then we spent a few weeks kind of unpacking some other things. Now, again, in this list of characteristics in Titus 1 and in 1 Timothy 3, it's not exhaustive. That is, it's not everything that there is to say about it. God's word isn't exhaustive. It's what I mean when I say that is he's not revealing every single truth there is. He's selectively revealing truth, right? Same goes here. These are the general character traits that kind of describe what a blameless person looks like. There are perhaps more things, but again, Paul's not saying everything there is to say, and not everything in Titus' list is in Timothy's list, and vice versa. But this is important stuff. This is key character stuff. It's stuff that shouldn't be ignored. And if you're looking, well, what else? What else should I consider beyond 1 Timothy 3 or beyond Titus 1? I would say there's some wisdom things to consider, and if you want some of those wisdom things, check with Chad, and he could pull up some messages from last summer. Again, we probably spent 4 weeks or so kind of dealing with some wisdom issues to look for in a pastor. What?
On the website.
Oh, it's all on the website.
Search on the website.
It's available now on the website. Okay, so I could probably give you the dates. I want to say it was right around the end of, I want to say it was about August of 2020, September of 2020. But right after the 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7 section that we looked at. Anyway, this pastor that Titus needs to look for, these pastors that Titus needs to appoint, they need to have their marriages in order. That's essential that he has his marriage in order. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you, namely, and this is kind of like a description of what Paul kind of directed, like the type of guy that Paul directed Timothy to appoint. If any man is above reproach, and that's the same word that's used in 1 Timothy 3. It doesn't mean that a person's sinless. That's not possible, right? If a man says that he doesn't have sin, then he's a liar, and the truth of God is not in him. All fall short of the glory of God. So there's no pastor out there that's sinless. Blameless doesn't, that's what Pastor Thornton used to say. Blameless does not mean sinless, right? Remember he used to say that? No, we're still dealing with a sinner. Doesn't mean the guy doesn't sin. He does, and he will. And there's a lot of forgiveness that needs to happen both directions in a church, right? The pastor has to forgive a lot of things, and people have to forgive a lot of things. And it doesn't mean, being above reproach, doesn't mean that charges are not made against a pastor. In fact, I would argue that in many churches, the pastor is the most gossiped about guy in the congregation. All right. I think some years back, Molly said something about this over a lunch about not having, how did you put it, roast pastor for dinner on a Sunday afternoon, right? I think roast pastor is on the plate many times in many churches on many Sunday afternoon meals, right? So I would argue that in many churches, in many places, maybe even here, well, I don't know, right? I mean, if you're doing it, you're probably not gossiping about me to me, right? I mean, that wouldn't really be the most wise thing to do in the world. But in many churches, the pastor's the most gossiped about guy in the church. He's the guy most likely who's facing more charges than anyone in many churches, unfortunately. He'll get slandered. People talk badly about him. This is fact. People make false charges against him. This is fact. And as a Christian in the New Testament, in New Testament times, Christians would face reproach just for bearing the name of Christ. And we see that in Hebrews 10, 32 and 33. By the way, the reference this morning, the John 10:20 reference was right. I don't know what I turned to. I don't even know what I pulled up on the wall. Maybe I was in the wrong book. I don't know. Maybe I put in first. I don't even know what I did. I'll have to go back and look at the video because I'm still at a loss. Why did I think the reference was wrong? The reference was right. But, the user was wrong. It was user error on the computer. I thought for sure I typed in the right, but I don't know. I don't know what I typed. Hebrews 10:32. But remember the former days when after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. The early Christians faced persecution. They faced reproach just for the name of Christ. Early pastors faced reproach. The way that the thinking is, listen, if you want to destroy the church, you cut off the head. And that's how the world looked. Listen, the world Satan wants to destroy the church. And this is often how he does it. He will take a believer. First, he wants to get the pastors. He wants the pastors. If you could take down the pastor, if you can get a guy who disqualifies himself in ministry, you can not only damage the name of that pastor, you could damage the name of church and damage the name of Christ altogether. I mean, you could do great damage when you have a pastor who's not living, immorality. Okay, that will do great damage. But among the people, how Satan often works is he wants to, there's two methods, really, that I can discern. One is divide and conquer, right? Satan's playbook, divide the church and conquer. Two is separate the sheep from the fold. So isolate and attack. And that's what Satan does. That's what Satan does. Go after the head, cut off the head of the snake, right? That's how, Satan's the snake, but you understand. Satan wants to cut off the head as if the pastor's the head, right? We all know who the head of the church is, right? It's Jesus Christ. It's certainly not the pastor, but the pastor is the person of influence oftentimes. He's the one who's teaching the word of God. If you could get that guy to fall, you can destroy churches. You can destroy people. Divide and conquer, isolate and destroy. That's Satan's playbook. And there's more, right? I mean, you just think about Satan's devices. Satan will creep in and make us, influence us to be more worldly without even realizing it. There's all types of devices. But anyway, the blameless pastor, he is not a person where charges aren't made against him. He's a person where when the charges are made against him, and they will be made against him, most likely, that those charges, when placed under a microscope, don't hold up. So some of you know Pastor Stevenson, and he was, a well-respected pastor in our area, and for most of his life, never really had any issues. Most of his ministry never really had, as far as I understand, never really had any issues as he was pastoring. Over the last few years of his ministry, he had these types of problems where people were coming against him. And that's just the day that we're living in right now. The blameless pastor is not a sinless guy. He's not a guy who bears no reproach for the name of Christ. He's not a guy who charges aren't made against him. He's a guy that when that happens, when he's placed under the microscope, those charges don't hold up because he's a genuine Christian. He's been reconciled to God the Father through Jesus Christ. His walk is legitimate, and character attacks against him don't hold up. The blameless pastor is a strong spiritual leader who's made faith decisions in his life. His life is consistent with his profession of faith, which isn't always the case. And in 1 Timothy 3 and here, what we see is a description of what this is, above reproach. And the first description that we see, oh, by the way, why is it important that a pastor be blameless? Maybe you could throw a couple out there real quick. Why is this so important? Why is it important that a pastor be blameless in character? What are some practical results of a pastor who's maybe not blameless? Anyone? We're just thinking outside the box here. We're just thinking and talking.
In the box. Sorry. He would be a good example to the flock.
Okay, so if he's blameless, he's a good example to the flock. If he's not blameless, conversely, right, he then, as a poor example to the flock, what does that do for his ability to influence people? All right, so he's the one who's overseeing, he's the one who's influencing. He won't be able to effectively minister if he has bad character. He won't be able to minister the word. His preaching is going to mean little if his life doesn't support it. His evangelism is going to mean little if his character is questioned. I've talked to people who in their witnessing did some really questionable things, and the people said, well, how can you tell me about Jesus and you go to the bar, or you do drugs, or you ... And I've sat on the other end of the desk as people would tell me that, and I would say, well, you do realize that because you do these things, you're not able to effectively evangelize, right? Like it's the same thing with a pastor. If a pastor's character, his leadership's going to be questioned if his character is deficient. Blamelessness is necessary for those in church leadership. And so Titus needs to appoint biblically qualified pastors on the island of Crete. And those pastors need to be blameless. And those pastors need to be sexually moral people. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of tonight. That's the one character trait that I want to spend the rest of this message on. And then we'll go through the rest of them next week. I was originally thinking I wanted to go through this issue and the family in one setting and then kind of deal with the rest of them next week. And I just had so much to say about this, it just didn't work out to time-wise. But look at what verse 6 says. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife. The husband of one wife. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this, and this is kind of why we need to spend some time on this. Because a lot of people, when they look at this verse and when they look at this character trait, they think that it's talking about status, a person's status. And they fail to recognize that it's not talking about a person's status, but it's talking about his character. All right? And you say, okay, I'm not sure I'm with you there. Well, I'm going to unpack that so you can kind of hang with me there. Anyone here ever hear of IFCA? IFCA International, Independent Fundamental Churches America. They put out a magazine called Voice Magazine. Anyone hear of Voice Magazine before? Maybe a couple. In their 2017 magazine, June 2017, I talked about this a little bit last year. There's an article about this very idea. And if you're interested in that, I could probably send it to you. Send me a text. Send me an email, not a text. If you send me a text, my email is my to-do list. So if you want to get something from me, send me an email, and I think I have the article. I could shoot it over to you. But anyway, in this article, they appropriately write that the words in the original language, the husband of one wife, mean a one-woman man or a one-wife husband. And in this article, they suggest several different ways that this phrase has been understood and, I would argue, misunderstood. Okay. Again, this is a review for some of you. Some people think this phrase, the husband of one wife, they think this means that pastors must be married. And if he's not married, then he can't be a pastor. There are all types of examples that would disprove that. For instance, Jesus wasn't married. Right? I know that the Masons would like to argue otherwise, and some other cult members would like to argue otherwise. Jesus wasn't married. The Apostle Paul was never married. In fact, the Apostle Paul, not only was he never married, but he encouraged Christians to not marry. Did you know that? Encouraged Christians to not marry unless, they were burning with lust, in which case then it's better to marry than to burn, that is, to burn with lust. So the Apostle Paul already talks about that a little bit. And then you have other examples of guys who, maybe they've chosen to live a life of celibacy, or they've lost their spouse. So this is not it. This is kind of a misunderstanding. This is that status misunderstanding that, the guy has to be in a marriage. That's not what this means. Some people think that pastors must not be polygamists. That is, he can't have 2 wives. He can't have 3 wives or 4 wives. And that certainly was an issue in the Apostle Paul's day, but very unlikely that that's what Paul has in mind here. Again, that's another one of those status things. None of the other qualifications in 1 Timothy or in Titus, none of them deal with status. They're all dealing with character. Right? They're all character issues. Some people think that this means that the pastor must never have been divorced. And that's based more on the English translation than it is on the Greek. Some would even say that if a man was divorced before he became a Christian, then he can never ever serve as a pastor. Or if a man committed sexual immorality before he was a Christian, or if he had premarital sex before he was a Christian, or anything like this, then he's never ever qualified to serve in ministry. And yet that's faulty, because how do you judge a person's spiritual character on their behavior before they were saved? Before they have the Spirit of God? I mean, look at the Apostle Paul's behavior before he has the Spirit of God. He's standing in approval to Stephen's murder. He's chasing after Christians, breaking up homes, putting them in prison. You know, you can't judge the Apostle Paul's character on what he did when he was lost. And so some people really have it wrong. I would say that this is an error. This whole view of must never have been divorced isn't quite understanding what the original text is saying. And hear me out for a second. So, in context, the best view here is that the pastor must be sexually moral and therefore totally committed to his wife, with the assumption that in the ancient world, most people got married. All right, that's kind of the context here. And this is why it's different and better than any of the other views, okay? The biblical pastor is a one-woman man. Character, not status. It's not saying if his status is that he's only ever been married to one woman, then, you know, in today's world, right? I guess that was a Freudian slip. Yeah, there's some wild things going on today. That's for sure. Anyway, like I know of lesbian pastors. They're married and they have like an adopted kid. You know what I mean? Like there's some wild stuff going on right now, and completely ignoring anything Scripture says there. But if your view is a status view, then the guy's been, if he's the husband of one wife, then his status is that he's married and he's never been divorced. But you want to know why that view is lacking its context? Because, okay, he's married. But, you know, that's okay. That's all he needs to be. He can, he can lust after other women. He's married. His status is covered. He can lust after other women. He can cheat on his wife. He can view pornography. He can pleasure himself. He can, you know, whatever. Run the whole gamut of sexual sin. But his status is right because he is the husband of one wife. He's still with her. She's never left him. Their status is married and never divorced. It's just a mistaken view. This is speaking about character, not status. That is, the man is completely devoted to his wife, assuming he's married, as most men in the ancient world would have been. He's not sleeping around. He doesn't fantasize about other women. He doesn't view pornography or pleasure himself or flirt with other women. He's a one-woman man. This is character. It's a character issue. It's more than these other views. It's a character issue. Now, the question would come up, can a man be divorced and serve in an office in the local church? And I would say perhaps, but only if his character is clear that he is a one-woman man. Only if it has been clearly established that he is a one-woman man. And the scenario is going to be specific about that. And that's not something that happens overnight. Or even in a few years. It may take many years or even decades for a man to show himself to be a one-woman man, given the mark of divorce on his life. The next question that would come up is, can a man be a pastor if he's been divorced? And you know, there are good people. Again, as far as the office of a deacon, it is an exception, and a great exception that stands the test of time, that displays clear character. When it comes to a pastor, there are good people that say, a guy could, over decades of time or whatever could display himself as a one-woman man in certain scenarios, or maybe the wife, she left him or whatever else. I don't know. There are other good people that say that divorce is too great an obstacle for any pastor to overcome in the eyes of a congregation. And I don't pretend to know everything there is to know about Scripture, and I don't pretend to know all the answers. I don't know. I know that some people that I know and trust, like Dr. Harbin says, it's just too big of an obstacle for a pastor to overcome. And then there's a whole bunch of people who would watch or listen to Charles Stanley who would think otherwise, right? I mean, because if you think about Charles Stanley, what happened with Charles Stanley? Charles Stanley went through a divorce. His wife claimed that he neglected the marriage, that his love was ministry and not her. And what do I know? I don't know anything about Charles Stanley's life or ministry or marriage. But she says, he neglected me. He wasn't interested in me. She divorced him. He suggested that he resign, and as far as I understand, the church said no, and he continued being the pastor after being divorced. And millions of people listen to Charles Stanley today in spite of that. So, look, I don't pretend to know all the answers. That rubs me the wrong way. I at least think that he needed to resign for some period of time. Maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years. I don't know. I don't know what the number is. I don't know. But it bothers me. It bothers me. It really does. The point of this phrase is clear, and that is that the overseer must be sexually moral. He must be a one-woman man. He must be committed to his wife. Why? As I said last year, the pastor deals with women. He's in a place with trust with women, and women may come to him about their marriage, and the pastor needs to be trustworthy in dealing with women. He needs to be responsible to handle them in a godly way. Last year I brought up the Billy Graham rule, and most of you know I'm not the biggest fan of Billy Graham's ministry, right? I mean, Billy Graham would go from place to place and he would present the gospel, and that's great, that's good and fine. But then when somebody came forward and prayed, some version of some sinner's prayer to get saved, which oftentimes it wasn't even a proper understanding of the gospel, they'd come forward and they'd pray to get saved. And then Billy Graham, his ministry would send them back to their lost churches to be discipled. So how do you stand for a ministry like that? A guy comes forward, he gets saved, he says he wants to devote his life to the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, let me connect you with your local Catholic priest who will disciple you. Like, what? There's no way I would lead someone to the Lord and send them to the Roman Catholic Church that rejects the gospel. There's no way. Would you? Or a mainline denominational church that rejects the gospel? The Roman Catholic Church says that if any man believes in salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, let that person be accursed to the fires of hell. You send him back to that place? I wouldn't. I'm not sending a saved person to be discipled by a lost person, by a false teacher. I'm not going to do that. So I'm not really the biggest fan of Billy Graham's ministry for that reason. Well, anyway, he was right about one thing, and that was how to handle women. Billy Graham would not be alone with a woman. They call it the Billy Graham rule. I don't think they should call it the Billy Graham rule. I think I said last year they should call it the Joseph rule. Look what happened to Joseph in Genesis, right? When Joseph was alone with a woman, the whole situation didn't work out so well. She had bad intentions, and she made false charges against him, and that made him very vulnerable, put him in jail. It got him in jail, right? Of course, God used all of that for his glory. But they should call it the Joseph rule, but they call it the Billy Graham rule. His rule is you're never alone with a woman, and that's for your protection and hers. And that's my rule. So if I need to counsel a woman, I invite her down to the house when my wife's there, and sometimes my wife and I will sit in my study back there, and we'll talk with the woman. Sometimes I'll talk with the woman with the door open, and the kids, or look, this is just what it's going to have to be. If there's private things, you could talk quietly, but the door's going to be open, and we're not going to be alone. And that's just what it is. And then oftentimes I try to put the lady with another woman, because another woman can really help a woman with certain things that a pastor really can't help her with. But he protects himself against charges of infidelity. And he protects himself against more than that, because I've heard more than one story, and I know at least a person or so where they were trying to help someone, they were in counseling sessions, seemingly spiritual person. Before you know it, those counseling sessions are taking place over lunch. Before you know it, those counseling sessions are taking place in a hotel room. And then a several-month-long affair ensued. Praise the Lord, there was repentance and restoration in that situation. Unsuspecting women can be vulnerable to the sexual advances of quote-unquote powerful men. All right? Do we have any examples of that in our political world? I think we might have a couple over the last few presidents, not the last few, but maybe the last couple, and a president in the 90s as well that had a pretty rough situation there, I would say. There are times when a woman's not satisfied in her marriage and she desires a husband who is spiritual, and she sees a godly person who's trying to help her with her problem. She interacts with the spiritual leader and she says, man, I want a guy like that. And that can be a recipe for disaster. It can absolutely be. A pastor without integrity can take advantage of a situation like that. That's why this is so important. Couple examples. Jim Baker. Jim Baker convinced his secretary that having relations with him was a good thing. He said, if you take care of the sheep, if you take care of the shepherd, you're taking care of the sheep. And that's how he convinced his secretary to be with him sexually. And when it's all said and done, the secretary turns away from the faith completely and starts modeling for Playboy magazine. This was like in the 80s or something. Jimmy Swaggart was repeatedly caught cheating on his wife with prostitutes. So he got caught literally with his pants down. And he made a big showing of it on TV. I have seen. And you see the congregation, there are ladies, they're crying. But he didn't resign. Oh, that's a one-woman man, isn't it? A pastor needs to have sexual integrity because some women are attracted to men with quote-unquote power, and these women view the office of a pastor as one with quote-unquote power. All right? That couldn't be, there's so many things wrong with that. There are so many things wrong with that. First, it's a complete misunderstanding of the office of a pastor. Pastors are servants, not authoritative dictators. It's not about power, it's about service. He who wishes to be first shall be last. And it's not about building the pastor's kingdom like we talked about this morning. It's about building the Lord's kingdom. You might say, Christian women don't think like that. I said this last year. Well, that may or may not be true. But what makes you think that every so-called Christian woman is a godly woman? And what makes you think that every church woman is a Christian woman? I'm going to tell you, as I said something similar this morning, some of the most ungodly people I have met were church people. Some of the people who have treated me the worst than I've ever been treated by anyone in my life, were church people. I think the most ungodly woman I've ever interacted with was a church woman. So you say, church women don't think like that. I'm going to tell you, maybe genuine Christians don't think like that. Maybe they do. I don't know. Maybe weak, genuine Christians. Church people think all types of crazy things. Okay? And there's a difference between genuine Christians and church people. Okay? Anyway, it absolutely is a factor. A pastor's morality shows up in his marriage. He must be faithful to his wife. Yarbrough basically says that how a man handles his marriage is a litmus test for his character in every other domain of his life. Titus needs to appoint biblical pastors in the churches of Crete. He needs to appoint pastors who are blameless, whose marriages are in order, whose houses are in order. And we'll talk about that next week, along with a few other things. Whose children are in order. That's something we'll talk about next week. Fortunately, we don't have time to really deal with it. I knew we wouldn't have time to deal with it, so. Oh wait, next week? Yeah, we have next week. It's 2 weeks we don't have. Okay. This is a passage, Titus 1, 5 through, you could say verse 8 or 9, verse 11, depending on where you want to cut the passage off. It's a passage that's really more about me than it is about, it's more for me than it is for you. It's for you in that there comes a day when you will have to, given the types of churches that we're in, a congregationally governed church. Our church is governed by the congregation decides, in so much as they want to decide, where you will either have or will inevitably elect, or what's the word we use? Approve, candidate, approve a vote to candidate and accept a pastor, where you essentially select a pastor. We could use that term. You know, there's terms, they're the right Christian terms, and they're like not in my head right now, so that's okay. But at the end of the day, the congregation approves its pastor in churches like ours. And so it's important because you need to have these things in mind when you're in a position where you have to appoint a pastor or vote on a pastor, or if you're moving, like there are people, we've had two families, one family that's moved, another family's moving, where you're going to be going to a place, and I've got to, what pastor am I going to sit under? And I've got to look at 1 Timothy 3. I've got to look at Titus. And I would really recommend that you go back and, I know it's long, there's a lot of things, but go back and listen through 1 Timothy 3 and go back and listen through some of those extra biblical things and listen through this week and next week. So for you guys, there's value there. And there's value in holding me accountable as a pastor. Like, you know, is he faithful to his wife? You know, what about his house? What about his character? And different things like this, right? So there's value there for you, but by and large, this passage is for me. This is what I need to be. I can't become this as I'm pastoring necessarily, right? Because these are biblical qualifications for being a pastor. So it's not like, well, I'm like one or two of these things. I'm going to keep working towards some of them, and hopefully I become more of them. It's not like that type of thing. This is what I need to be in order to be a pastor. I think the Christian world's got that backwards. Like a lot of guys are like, well, you know, I hope I'm going to get better. I'm going to become a one-woman man, as you know. I'll become a one-woman man again, and that was kind of like Charles Stanley's, you know, whatever, or whomever. So this passage is really for me. This is what I need to be. It's for you. This is what you need to hold your pastors, future pastor, whatever, accountable to be. And I would argue that the American church has failed miserably when it comes to this. The American church, part of the reason why they're so biblically illiterate is because they've been appointing men who are not qualified and accepting men who are not trained and qualified, and followed these men in their biblical illiteracy and become or remain biblically illiterate themselves. But Titus was to appoint biblically qualified men. And again, in churches like ours, that role belongs to the church. And so this is very much for you, as much as it's for me. Because when I'm gone, and I hope it's not for another 20 or 30 years, you know, I hope I'm here for a long time, but listen, life happens. There's no guarantee I'll be here tomorrow. You know, and there's no guarantee I'll be here in 6 months. Maybe you don't want me to be here in 6 months or in 20 years, but I want to be here. I love being here, but at some point you're going to need to call a man who is blameless, a man whose marriage is in order, and the rest of what Titus has to say. Let's take our hymnals and turn to hymn number 26. We're going to sing the first and fourth verses of hymn number 26.